Hey, welcome back to our next episode of the South Texas Power Lunch. I'm here once again with Iris Gonzalez of Startup San Antonio, startupsanantonio.com. We are so happy to have you here yet again. I didn't run her off, thank goodness. To talk this time about all the great acquisitions that are going on in town here in 2021 and really talk about what does it need to be acquisition ready or exit ready for founders. So thank you so much for coming.
Well, thank you for having me. And I get to learn from experienced lawyers like you who do these acquisition deals because I write about them. But it's always good to know from a founder perspective, what do you need to know in order to make sure that your company is acquisition ready? It's ready to be purchased. So we hear terms being thrown around like acquisitions, exits. Is there a difference in terminology?
Yeah, I mean, another word you hear a lot is buy-sell, right? I've got a buy-sell agreement or buy-sell transaction.
Yeah, like how many different types of deals are there when it comes to buying your company?
When it comes to an exit where I'm buying a company, there's really only two.
Okay.
Makes it pretty easy, which is I'm either going to buy all the assets, what we call an asset purchase, or I'm going to buy the stock, which is a stock purchase. And there's pros and cons to both. And really, based upon the situation, it just really depends which one you're going to pick. For example, if I'm going to buy all the assets that are out there, I want to buy all the assets that operate the company. I'm going to figure out what I do with the employees, the intellectual property. But when I buy assets, I'm putting cash into the business in exchange for those assets. And I'm limiting my exposure to what I would call sins of the past, sins of the father. So if you're dealing with someone that may have had, a potential lawsuit or something that went wrong in the company, when I buy assets from someone, I don't continue to have what's called successor liability or the liability that came out of that entity when I buy assets. I just have the assets. It's kind of like when you buy a car. If I buy a car from you today and you had an accident yesterday, that accident is your issue, not mine, because I didn't owe the car on the day of the accident. You did. Same sort of situation.
Wow. So we had an example earlier this year of one of our cybersecurity startups called Level Effect. They sold their cyber tool to a company in Maryland by the name of Huntress. They sold the tool, but they still have the company.
Right.
So in other words, in that case, that was an asset deal.
It was more than likely an asset deal. What they probably did is they kind of cornered off that business segment or that operating unit of the company, and then they sold the assets out of it. So the intellectual property came out. Any sort of vendor contracts came out and were assigned. They may have assigned the employees, or maybe they did a little bit of they fired the employees, the other company hired the employees, and then they probably have what's called a transition agreement, so that way there's some common stuff that they could take some time to break apart. It was more than likely about 99.9% an asset transaction. And again, what the buyer gets is they get all the assets of that it takes to operate that business unit, but they don't get all that risk that they had prior to acquiring those assets. So it's a good deal for them.
And then what about in the case of Mailgun? Because that was a really successful acquisition where the whole company was sold. Right. Again, earlier this year. So then that would be stocks?
Well, actually, for something like that, you don't know. Because
it's not publicly.
This is a great quote.
The details are not publicly.
The details aren't publicly traded. And I'll tell you, this is a quote, and it's not mine, but I think it's a great quote. Businesses are bought, typically, 99% of the time, businesses are bought by the buyer, not sold by the seller.
Ooh, let's dig into that.
And here's why is when I'm a buyer, one, it's value to me. So in most circumstances, because it's value to me, I'm going to try to dictate the terms of what I'm buying because I get the value and I want to make sure that what I'm buying is what I believe my value will be in the future. So we tend to see buyer represented deals are different than seller represented deals. Now, sometimes that's different. Sometimes I could have the latest gadget and widget like you see on Shark Tank. When they've got something that's really, really good, all those sharks line up basically with their tongues hanging out saying, pick me, pick me. Sure. But as we watch Shark Tank, most of the time, the sharks are the one that are getting the better advantage. Same thing with a buyer. In that transaction, what we don't know is the how they did it, because if I'm the buyer, I don't want the sins of the past to follow me. Even when we buy whole companies, we will typically try to buy all the assets out as the buyer to leave any potential litigation or risk or things that are there in that old entity. I buy the assets come out, cash goes into that entity, and then we have distributions that take place. However, if some of the investors go forward, maybe I've bought the stock. It just depends. We won't know because those details aren't public. When I buy the stock, I'm literally buying all of the stock and I'm cashing them out. Sometimes we talk about tender offers, those sort of things. Sometimes a company's required to do a tender offer in order to have where a larger buyer can buy all the stock that's there because it's so widespread. When I buy the stock, it becomes a subsidiary of whoever the buyer was, maybe the holding company, and all of that company, all it did was just move the cap table as opposed to moving any of the assets and everything else. It's still the same owner of all that intellectual property and all that assets. Now just the cap table doesn't show previous owners. It shows me as owners if I'm the buyer.
Oh, interesting. So that's maybe how a sale would work if a holding company were buying a small business, for example?
That's correct. And then, to get even more, lawyer on you, sometimes we have what are called mergers where I set up my own new company, merge it in, reverse mergers. There's a lot of different ways to structure it. It's an important reason why if you're thinking about getting into an acquisition anytime soon is to talk with a lawyer as early as possible. An accountant and a lawyer and someone that's versed in tax are critical as you're starting to think about what does an exit look like.
Well, now you're touching upon some really actionable advice. So could you kind of walk us through, Matt, what any founder who's thinking about selling their company, what is that checklist? And you mentioned first off, make sure you have that professional team with that expertise in mergers and acquisitions supporting you. So that's accountants, your financial team, and of course your lawyer.
Yeah, that's right. And sometimes based upon where you're at, sometimes we have brokers that are involved. Because they're going to help, actively market, the business to their network. But a team on this one is number one. Getting the right team with the right experience for the right value. Everybody would love to have the best business broker in the entire, world to broker your business, but it comes at a cost. So making sure that the team's knowledge and value meet where you are on your acquisition. That would be number one. Number two then would be taking that team, combining them with your team and getting organized. We've talked about this in the previous episode about a tidy house for those that are coming in says a lot to your guests. Well, you're going to be marketing yourself for purchase. You need to make sure your house is in order financially, making sure the books are right. If your industry and your business looks like it needs to be audited, are all those audits done by reputable firms, clean audits that are there? From a corporate standpoint, from a legal standpoint, do you have your business corporate documents in order? Are your contracts organized, ready to go? Because diligence is a necessary part of an acquisition, and making sure that you can get that to the buyer so that way they can see what they're buying is critical.
So you get an offer, or at least you get, like say, an email, some kind of initial contact from an interested buyer.
Right.
What should you be doing besides making sure all your paperwork is in order? What about like looking into the buyer?
Yeah, I'm going to overgeneralize a little bit on this one.
Okay.
I typically encourage, because there's so many different ones.
Right.
If you're looking to do an exit, and you've gotten a team together because that's what you're doing, what I typically encourage the founder, the business owner to do is engage in a business dialogue with the purchaser on a business level. For example, can you start bucketing some of the business terms? What are you buying? How much are you buying it for? There are a multitude of templates and check boxes, checklists that are out there that you can start to be thinking through of what are my requirements to sell. And when you can get some sort of term sheet together, sometimes we have those as non-binding signed, or we get those formalized enough, then we will move to the next stage of a letter of intent.
Okay.
And a letter of intent is a more legal memorialization of the potential business transaction or exit.
Of how exactly the buyer intends to buy your company, whether it's shares, whether it's an asset.
That's right.
Depending on the deal.
If we're going to have things such as escrow, those sort of things. Those still are typically non-binding in nature. However, we get a lot at that level. It become what we call non-binding binding or binding non-binding. Leave it to lawyers to be inconsistent even in the way they name things. Mm-hmm. And the reason for that is in some circumstances, you're going to have what's called lockup agreements where the buyer says, hey, I'm going to now invest in digging into you. You can dig into me, but for 90 days, 30 days, you can't talk to anybody else. And so we're going to put those on. And everything else, the dollar amount and all these other terms, they're non-binding. But that agreement that you're not going to talk to anybody else, it is binding. And so that's where you start to get into more formalized document, especially if you've got some binding elements versus non-binding. Really caution people to make sure if they're being asked to sign anything at a letter of intent or term sheet or a memorandum of understanding, if you're signing something, make sure a lawyer's looking at it, because you never know what's binding and non-binding in these, and it's critical that you haven't sold the company at a level that it's not appropriate.
So, and that brings me to the next question I have about your checklist.
Right.
So it's making sure you have everything in order. I guess that would be the internal analysis of your company, or is that valuation? How does that factor into valuation? We hear valuation tossed around a lot.
Right.
Do you find that business owners understand valuation, or they need help?
I'm not even sure.
It's part of a business deal, right? It's a critical step.
Here's something I always remind people is, from an economic standpoint, transactions take place where a willing buyer and a willing seller meet. And that's also another term of what we call fair market value. Fair market values are a range. And again, it's whatever a seller is willing to sell and a buyer is willing to buy. So sometimes I get asked, do I need to go get a formalized valuation done, and spend $30,000 to do that? Maybe. Is it informative of what you're doing? Or is it better to have the right accounting team and broker look at industry metrics, those sort of things, deals that have been done, and help you get that range? Because it's a range of value that we look at for companies based upon multiples and whether, your revenue and all sorts of different factors. So that team will actually give you the best advice on that. And then it becomes a negotiation. And that's where I typically push owners and founders to do that business dance, which is, I'm willing to sell it to you for $20 million. Buyer says, I'm willing to buy it from you for $10 million. Have that dance. You don't necessarily need lawyers. You need a team advising you as you go through that, but you don't need the lawyer at that aspect. I do have clients from time to time say, you know what, you go ahead and do it, lawyer, and let the lawyers negotiate what we call a term sheet or a letter of intent between lawyers, and put us in the middle to do that negotiation. We can do that as well. But from a value standpoint, owners can have that dance and know their numbers better than a lawyer ever can. And so they could do that dance on their own.
So basically, owners need to be prepared to come to an agreement on what the strategic coincidence of interests are.
That's exactly right.
That intersection between your interests as a seller and the interests of the buyer.
That's right.
Right? They want to add your company because they need this capability and it's cheaper than creating it in-house, and you want to sell the company so you can go off and do something else.
And it's a negotiation, right? I mean, one of the biggest and the most exciting things we get to do is I negotiate for a living with regard to these corporate matters, and they're fascinating. I mean, and you can look at, Harvard Business has a great short-term course on negotiation. There's lots of great resources that are out there in negotiation, and that's what it comes down to, is a good old-fashioned negotiation. So that way the buyer and the seller come out on the price. Getting with that legal team to look at, when you get to that term sheet, letter of intent, for some of these critical factors that are in addition to the price, that's where your team steps in. For example, a lot of times what we see in all-out purchases for exits for more mature companies, not necessarily in startups, is will some of the money be escrowed? And what we typically look at is between 20 and 30% of the purchase price could go into an escrow account that is going to hold there for 12 to 24 months, usually on average 18, with certain criteria of when it's released to the seller.
So it's a schedule.
A schedule, and if
when the payments will happen.
Correct, and that money can be reduced if the buyer has what are called breaches of certain representations that were made or suffers damages from the past. So, for example, let's say I'm buying a company and I represent that the patent is valid, and but there's a potential lawsuit on the validity of it. We may put that money in escrow, and if it goes away and I'm right, I get my money. Or if there's more damages or something that has to be done to tweak it, the buyer may get it back to make them whole because it wasn't the expectation of what they sold. So there's a lot of complexity that come into the deal, whether it's stock or asset, that may be additional things outside of just price and strategy.
So for starters, what are some of the numbers that a business owner needs to know cold as they enter into this delicate negotiation phase of an acquisition?
You need to understand how a buyer is viewing your finances.
Okay.
Number one, And that will be the numbers that will drive things like EBITDA, right? That's very important multiple times, in certain times. However, in certain large tech, we're not basing valuation on EBITDA. We're basing it on something else, like your monthly, your monthly revenue, or your trailing 12 months monthly revenue with a multiple. And that's another thing you need to know is, what is your multiple? These are more financial than legal, but they become important to know when negotiating with a buyer, because you're trying to find something that's a fair market value.
And then because I'm a big believer in spelling out unfamiliar acronyms, EBITDA is
earning before
right, so
interest, taxes, and amortization.
So EBITDA. If anyone wants to Google that,
EBITDA.
Kind of because that's a number that anyone's going to ask you before anything else, right?
And again, your finance team and making sure you know what's in it, what's not, knowing those numbers or having readily accessible to those numbers, and industry standards for multiples. And how do they base those multiples?
Right, and that number basically, it allows you to compare. This is how it was explained to me.
Sure.
It allows you to compare companies that may be apples to oranges, but it's that mean number of what number is coming in, how much revenue is coming into the company.
Right.
And allows you to compare deal to deal to deal.
Deal to deal
right?
to deal.
Is that number good or bad? And then you factor in your monthly recurring revenue, right?
That's right.
Annual recurring revenue.
Yep.
What about churn rate, LTV?
Loan to, yeah.
And
it's loan to value. It's sometimes it's when I've got an asset I'm looking at. All right, those sort of things. There's some other terms for LTV.
So
There's
it's basically being upside down on a loan.
You could be.
Right?
You could be, exactly.
Like, I bought a warehouse and I'm paying for it, but
there's a deficiency there, and somebody's going to make that
the value's gone down and I owe more than what it's worth.
That's exactly right. But knowing what your assets are, those sort of things, what's your monthly, we talked about burn rate before, what's your burn rate, all these things are necessary. And again, it's making sure that team is right, because we've got some companies here in town that are being looked at for acquisition, and they're pre-revenue or relatively in pre-revenue.
Very early, yeah.
And so their numbers for a sale are going to be very different than some of the companies we deal with that have been in operation for 6-7 years.
Sure. And
we can look back, and there's immature industries. So that team is what matters, and knowing whatever your valuation numbers are and how the industry are, that's important to know.
And knowing the industry too.
Correct.
Because if it's an industry that's going to take a hit for whatever reason.
That's right.
And boy, have we seen some interesting impacts that we couldn't have predicted before March 2020.
Right.
Right?
Right.
So if anything, due diligence has gotten maybe even a little bit more involved, I would think.
Absolutely. Absolutely. The best experience is a bad experience.
Well, yes, it does teach
unfortunately, because it teaches you all those lessons, right? And unfortunately with COVID, with COVID, and then I'll also say that we're seeing now in this community that venture capital and investment funds that had 7 to 10 year horizons, they're starting to now close and distribute. So now we've got some companies that unfortunately may not make that next cut, or they may be in that valley of the death, even though they were in a later funding round, because just that's the end, and they've got to, VCs have got to exit, and so if they're going to have to exit, they're going to put pressure, and it's time to, sell to a major client, or to do those type of exits. Sometimes your investors are pressuring you for that exit as well.
And then what about representations and warranties that you might have to provide?
Yeah, lawyers, the interesting thing about, there's only 2 types of deals, asset and stock, but the every single deal is slightly different. But what comes in a deal, whether I'm selling assets or I'm selling stock, is I'm going to be asked by the buyer, and the buyer is the one that drives it.
Right.
I want you to tell me that certain things are true. That would be a representation. Tell me on this date it's true. And then I also want you to warrant that it will remain true. So that's a representation versus a warranty. What you fill into those blanks of these statements will vary. Certain things, like I want you to tell me that you were actually legally formed in the state of Texas. That's going to be true on a certain day. Certain things like these contracts are valid on this date. If that is false, now I have a breach of contract for potential damages from the buyer, because you told me that contract was valid and binding, and when I bought it, and paid you that money, I found out it wasn't true.
Right. And if there's considerable impacts from that, then it's going to
Yeah,
cost you.
It is. And that's where lawyers right there, where you get to where we can just, I mean, depending upon what the deal is, the complexity can steamroll from there.
Wow.
When you look at a deal, you're typically looking at there's consideration. There's something being purchased. There's that buy and sell. Could be stock, could be assets. And those assets could be everything as part of the business or very specific. There's excluded assets if you're doing an asset deal. Then you get into certain representations and warranties. And those can range from very simple to very complex, from HR and tax issues and intellectual property issues and real estate and environmental issues. I mean, the list goes on and on and
Sure.
on. And then we get to what's called indemnification, which says if I, as the buyer, am damaged because of what you as seller did in the past, I should be able to be made whole. That's indemnification. And then we may have certain conditions or restrictive covenants like, hey, you can sell me the business, but now you can't compete against me for 5-10 years. Those sort of things. So there's a general structure to these deals that, M&A attorneys were very familiar with, but the complexities can roll on from there.
Depending upon your business, how big it is,
depending
how mature
upon your
it is,
business,
the
and
sector,
then things like how
industry.
material is some of this stuff,
Right,
Like,
right.
do I really need to have an environmental section when I'm a tech company leasing space, in geekdom? I don't. So we can throw it away. And there's some things called material adverse effects and event. Again, it can get very complex. It's important, though, that you understand there's a process. And when you get to that definitive agreement, it's critical that you have the right legal team behind you that's delivering the right value for you for your exit.
Well, especially because of your quote, which I find very interesting. Well, and it's true. Of all the stories I've written about acquisitions, it's the buyer that drives the process.
It is.
It's the buyer that really is the driving force in determining the value of your company.
Right.
Even though you have all the numbers, you've done your due diligence, you have an opinion, of course, of what your company is worth. But the question there is the buyer willing to pay that price?
It is. One thing that I will tell all sellers that you have the company.
Right. And if they really want it badly enough.
Exactly. And so, lawyers, we get into a lot of this back and forth of like the representations, the warranties, the indemnification, the escrow, blah, 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 legal.
Right.
At the end of the day, a seller can say, you know what, here's what I have. Here's the value that I'm selling. Here's the risk of you buying it that I'm willing to get based upon the consideration, yes or no. And so they always remember, even though the buyer's the one doing it, that seller, unless you're in a position of vulnerability, which sometimes, we are, you really get to be able to drive what's valuable for the deal in what you're doing versus the buyer. Because a lot of times I see buyer counsel trying to drive up, a lot of things that are unnecessarily for, my clients. I do a lot of sell side stuff that they shouldn't have to worry about or pay about. So
in other words, know your value, know your worth.
Know the value, stand behind the value of the deal, stand behind the value of what you're selling, look at it from the other side. These are all negotiation tips, and then don't let the process get out of control because it can. Buyers can drive processes out of control.
Well, that's really, really good to know. Now, as we kind of head into the final lap
Right.
of this particular fascinating podcast episode, what are the most common reasons for failure that you see in a negotiation for an acquisition?
Ooh. The most common, and it happens more often than we would like it to, is even before we get to a definitive agreement that is signed.
Right.
As the process moves forward with certain representations in draft format being put in place, and as both sides start to take on the reality of what either they're going to be repped to or have to rep, the deals fall apart based upon diligence. Because again, everybody understanding their value. So if the buyer says, look, I want you to say that all these contracts, all 1,000 of them are valid and will can continue after we close on this deal, and says that's a non-negotiable, the seller may go, that's not going to work for me.
Too much.
Or the buyer may say, hey, I need you to have your financial statements updated. You haven't updated them in 3 years.
Oh my goodness.
I'm going to need you to rep as of, the last quarter. And the seller goes, I'm not going to do that. I'm out. Or the buyer looks at it when they get updated and goes, oh, that's bad. I'm out. It's usually during that process, because it goes hand in hand with diligence, that when they get to that definitive agreement, the buyer knows what they're buying. and what kind of reps and warranties they get into the future, what kind of protection they get from indemnification. And the seller knows, here's the purchase price. I've let go of my baby, my company, and here's the risk I have to keeping that purchase price or actually getting all that purchase price if it's in escrow. When those finally set in, as you narrow it down, that's when they decide to sell. I will tell you that in almost every deal I'm a part of, and I don't think this is me, a deal typically dies 2 to 3 times before it's finalized because of that reality. Because the buyer or the seller will go, I'm not doing that, I'm out. There's your death. And then they go back and sit through it and think about the value and then the totality of it all.
Found another company that does this.
And then they come back to the table.
Building that capability
and come back to the table. I mean, lawyers we find in almost every single deal, very rare. I mean, I went through one actually last summer that was just the greatest deal in the world. Everybody just figured out how to get it done. I don't know if COVID helped or what, but typically you'll have lawyers be told, put pencils down, stop billing, deal's off. And then, a day, 2 days, or a month later, pick that pencil back up. The deal's back
Resurrection.
on. So it gets to be tough because really there is, and that's the accountability of a contract, a purchase agreement, that brings the parties together with their reality versus, oh, hey, will you sell your company for $10 million? Sure, I'll sell it for $10 million. Here you go. That's not how it works. So that reality can cause a lot of stress and it can do it. But that's the number one of why they die is the representations. When they start getting through those, it's not either what the company thought it was that was buying it or the seller is willing to go ahead and put out there.
Well, it's funny. I won't name names, but I do hear founders complaining about how lawyers kill deals.
Lawyers can. Lawyers really can.
Some lawyers.
Some lawyers can. And really what lawyers will get down to so much is it's risk reward. That's we're doing a risk allocation with our contracts.
Okay. So it's risk management.
It's basically risk management. I mean, when I sign a $5 million deal for my healthcare client, and I'm looking at, are they getting the value and are they protected adequately? Now, I can go too far, but then when I go too far and try to push it, there's 2 things. I run the risk of causing a massive legal bill or running off the deal. And I have to, as a lawyer, balance that with my client to make sure I'm getting them exactly what they need for informed risk allocation, risk management for what they're doing. Same thing with a purchase agreement. Am I, for example, there's a certain threshold that it costs to get, a company sold. I mean, these can be tens of thousands of dollars to do this. I mean, this could be hundreds of thousands of dollars depending upon,
Sure.
a massive company that's public. I mean, I've done that in my past as well. But is there added value for the company that's being sold for $1 million to, be spending hundreds of thousands of dollars versus $10,000? I don't know. More than likely not. Lawyers thinking through trusted advisor, delivering value and that risk, which there are some excellent lawyers here in San Antonio that do that. But across the country, I would tell you on the other side, I run into people that are just unreasonable. And they're just running up the price for their own billable hours for their business versus their client's interest, or more importantly, my client's interest on the sell side.
Or they might have a mindset of zero risk, which is
impossible.
It's impossible.
It's impossible, right?
There's a risk with everything you do.
There is. And, there are excellent attorneys. I mean, I've dealt with some great attorneys on the other side. And the best transactions are ones where the founders, the owners, and deal counsel understands the risk-reward trade-off, draws lines where they're appropriate for certain risks, and they do it on both sides, and then says, okay, here's where we are, keeping clients informed, and then the business people make that ultimate decision. Lawyers that try to figure it out themselves a lot of times, which is what we can see is, who's got the,
who's driving it.
Who's driving it, right, can just, ring it up for their founders. But again, we've got some excellent attorneys here and some that I've have as mentors and friends that have really taught and demonstrated for me and for this community how not to get into that trap.
Okay, good. That's good to know. What about in the instance where there's an acquisition and then there's also the provision for the founder to go work for the company that's just bought his business?
Yeah, no, it's very typical we see is when someone's buying a company, they want to also get the knowledge.
Sure.
So
troubleshooting.
Yes. So what we see typical in almost all deals that we're doing, where there's some sort of go forward, is you're going to have potentially a firing and hiring of individuals, key employees. But then the management team, including the founder, if they're actively engaged in that, will typically get either independent contractor, consulting deals, or employment deals in the acquirer. And those can become critical as well because sometimes there's non-competes. Most of the time there is non-competes. And so you want to make sure that you're getting your future income that matches the risk of what your sale price was. Case law that's out there is I can do a very restrictive non-compete when I'm selling my business. Like you could say, Matt, we're going to buy your video game business for $10 million. You can't ever create a video game for the next 5 years.
Right.
Texas law has said that's valid to do, and you can't do it anywhere. They can hold you accountable to that. However, I'm an employee or even an independent contractor in some standpoints. You can't bind me for years and years to restrict my income if that's what I am, a video game developer. So it's much more restrictive in the employment and independent contractor contracts than it is the sale of a business. Understanding how these pieces work together is critical for a founder.
And that's why it's important to have that trusted legal counsel from the beginning as soon as you realize, okay, I think I'm going to be selling my business.
Exactly. And you don't want to have yourself bound into somewhat indentured servitude for 5 years. I mean, a lot of times, you want to negotiate the deal so that way maybe it's a 3 to 5 year deal. Sometimes they only want you 18 months. It just depends. Most of the
transition.
You're either in a transition type of deal or you're in a we want you on our team deal. Right. And so you're looking at 12 to 18 months if it's a transition type deal versus 3 to 5 years if it's a longer term deal. But you also want to make sure, hey, what if you don't want to do this? I mean, you're getting a pretty good chunk of change. What if that bank account is looking at you saying, hey, this is really, really good. I want to go use it, but I'm still working 90 hours for the new job. How can you get out? Making sure your trusted advisor understands the deal plus the go forward is important because those type of agreements matter.
So as we wrap up this really fascinating discussion about acquisition, kind of the behind the scenes of how deals are made or not made, right? Right. What would you tell a company founder, company owner who's decided, I want to sell my business? Keeping in mind your quote that businesses are generally bought, not sold.
Right.
I want to sell my business. Or do you recommend they go, is there like a brokerage or an exchange for selling businesses? I mean, how does that work if you're at the very beginning and you're thinking, I'm ready to sell my business for whatever reason?
Yeah. Number one, I would highly recommend to not engage a broker. In my experience, except when you're dealing with, $100, $200, $300 million, when you've got, those power brokers that are involved, broker fees are unnecessary because unless they enter you into a high value network that you don't have access to. If you're looking to sell your business, what I would recommend is get the right mentors together, let them know what you're thinking. You probably already have them. You've got a board.
Sure.
You've got, investors that, they're going to need to know. Sometimes, many times it's going to take approval by the stockholders or by the members of your LLC. Maybe there's those key, chairman of the board conversations. Get with your existing governance body, let them know what you're thinking, get them to have buy-in, then look at your industry and strategize on how best to get that information out if you're going to try to actively market your company.
Right, because you're not going to be able to go on Facebook and say,
you can't.
Hey, no, of course, because SEC rules,
that's
right?
right.
We talked about the
That's
regulation
right, public
D.
solicitation. We're not going to be able to do that. But you're going to find either between your investor, your cap table, or your customer list, or the network you generally keep in the industry, your buyers in there.
Someone who already knows your product or service.
Well, and maybe it's not that person, but it's that person that knows somebody.
Right.
Many times I'm dealing with somebody that had knowledge and they were a connector. Because many times we have a lot of connectors that are, part of our community.
That makes a critical introduction to someone.
Correct. So have that, get those mentors, get that team together. Because as we've talked about, there are so many different, no two deals are alike, even though there's only two types of deals. I mean, the permutations of those are endless.
Right.
That team, getting your governance, your board, your managers, however you're structured on board, those are steps 1 and 2. And then from there, you're going to be on a journey. And making sure you have the right team to deal with whatever that journey brings, then that's what you're ready for.
Well, this has been an incredibly fascinating discussion. I mean, talks in terms of what it takes to actually sell a company.
Yeah, it's been wonderful to get to talk about it. I mean,
right.
Because sometimes people just don't understand what that means. They just say, hey, I'm going to sell my company. Well, there's a lot more to that. And on the last thing I'd leave you with is, if you're a buyer of companies, whether you're buying a multi-million-dollar purchase price, or I say if you're buying something over $3 to $4, maybe $500,000,
Right.
it's important to find someone to paper that correctly. I always think about buying a house.
Okay.
If you're going to buy a house, you're going to have closing costs, between $10,000.
Inspection fees.
Why
all sorts
is that?
Of things, right.
Because the bank, because there's a mortgage, is what causes most of those costs, wants to ensure that they got what they're paying for because they gave the note for it. For what we do, we've got some options that can cost, people around $5,000. We got some flat fee we can do for people around there. Think about it in context. Isn't it worth the money to make sure it's papered right of what you're buying, to make sure that you get exactly what the bargain of your purchase price was for? And that's something just as a key consideration, because so many times I have people, even multi-million dollars, I don't need a lawyer. And that can become a critical mistake when it comes to things not being what you thought they were, which in most circumstances, it's never the same of what you thought it was going to be.
So this is going beyond due diligence into like investigative,
Yep.
Searching for, like you said, the warranties or any kind of hidden risks that may not be apparent at
That's
first
right.
glance.
That's right. Having a lawyer that's doing this to look in and say, are there some red flags? It's important to know. And then make sure it's papered correctly. So that way, again, you can say, I do own this. I've had companies that have come to me and spent, I guess $750,000 for one of them. And they bought it in their own individual name, all the assets.
So now the tax implications are mind-blowing.
Mind-blowing,
And
right?
I'm not an accountant.
Exactly. So you could get that. So bringing
Right.
someone early on, and again, just making sure that you're getting the right structure is important for those. And there's going to be a cost. Lawyers do add value. We do. People avoid us worse than dentists, but we do add value in there. There's some really good ones in our community. I'd like to think I'm one of them, but I know a lot of them. Again, as I've talked about, there's mentors and friends that we have a great legal community to help founders, those that are trying to exit.
And if anything, our legal community here locally has grown leaps and bounds since I started writing about startups. So it's great to see that not only do we have more venture capitalists that are interested in investing in companies that are based here in San Antonio, but that we have that growth in legal advisors like yourself that have realized, hey, there's a thriving community here and they all need this type of advice.
That's exactly right. Iris, I can't thank you enough for spending a couple of episodes with us to talk about this. We don't get to talk about it as much, but these nuts and bolts, a lot of people just don't talk about them enough. They talk about pitch decks and the business side of being a founder, but that legal side has a major, major impact for our founders and our investment community here. So it's been great to get to talk about this. Thank you.
Thanks so much for being so good-natured at answering all the questions, too.
It's been fun. It's been fun.
Great.
Well, we thank you for taking the time to listen to us or watch us on YouTube. If you're listening to us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, if you click that subscribe button, let us know we're adding value for us. Leave us a comment. Let us know what you're interested in or any feedback. Just like always, we'll have in our descriptions links to startupssanantonio.com, so that way you can see all the great information that Iris and her team put out there on a daily basis. It's fantastic. If you're watching us on YouTube, thanks again. Subscribe to us, leave us a comment, give us a like. We really appreciate you, and we'll see you next time. Thanks.